For 14 years, they raised every part of Afghanistan against me, lamented the country's emir, Abdur Rahman Khan, in an 1897 letter to the Imperial Commissioner in Peshawar. He was complaining about a vast network of the mullah of Hadda village, Najimuddin Akhundzada, both in the plains country and in the hills, and thousands of men perished on both sides. What calamities are there that they have not suffered? What blood have they not shed by his senseless commands? Khan asked. 2 centuries on, that sentiment may seem familiar to the generals in Islamabad who are grappling with their own Hadda mullah. Nur Wali Mahsood, the charismatic cleric who has rebuilt the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan or TTP jihadi group from the ashes of defeat into a resurgent force that's taking on the Pakistan army. Even if the generals were still gloating about installing a proxy regime in Kabul, expert Daud Khatak reported that the TTP had brought about a sharp increase in jihadi violence in Pakistan. Last year, there were 294 attacks, up 56% from 2020, and 45 of those in December alone. 395 people have been killed, figures much higher than Kashmir. The forever war America has extricated itself from is clearly far from done. This week, Islamabad issued a new national security policy calling, among other things, for peace and trade with neighbors. This is good news for countries like India, but offers little real guidance on the big national security question for Pakistan itself. Should it go to war against its jihadis or try and buy peace? Like an onion, the answer to that question has many, many layers. The first of these are proximate. In the build-up to the Taliban's victory, the scholar Antonio Guistosi has written that Pakistan's ISI tried ineffectually to rein in its jihadi clients in Afghanistan. The Pakistani military severely curtailed support, he wrote, both in funding and supplies to the Haqqanis, who resisted the United States-Taliban agreement and were widely seen as trying to sabotage it. But estimated to make millions of dollars from narcotics trafficking and protection rackets, which target everything from mining to trucking, the Haqqanis responded by simply deepening their relationship with Al-Qaeda. They just didn't need the ISI's money. Late last year, in an extraordinary closed-door briefing, Pakistan Army Chief Qamar Javed Bajwa and former ISI Chief Lieutenant General Faiz Hamid warned the political leadership of the gathering storm. As victory neared, they said, the Afghanistan just wasn't listening to the Pakistan army. Worse, the TTP, the Pakistani end of the Taliban, was growing in power. From experience, the generals knew what would come next. In 2004, as the CIA had begun drone strikes against Al-Qaeda leaders hiding in Pakistan, they responded with retaliatory terrorism. The army then sought to make deals with the TTP, ceding de facto control of swathes of territory. In April 2004, Nur Wali Mahsood's successor, Nek Mohammad Wazir, had even shared the stage with 11 Corps Commander Lieutenant General Syed Safdar Hussain, promising that in a war with India, the jihadi leader would be, and I quote, Pakistan's atomic bomb. In 2014, the Pakistan army finally gave up on deal-making and went to war. Thousands of civilians were killed in the bitter fighting that followed before the army succeeded in driving the TTP into Afghanistan. Soon after, though, the ISI began reaching out to the jihadis in a bid designed to wean them away from the Islamic State and thus becoming a perpetual threat to the Pakistani state. Through the Haqqanis, ISI agents succeeded in securing several deals with TTP commanders like Aslam Farooqi, who returned the favor by staging suicide attacks against Indian interests in the region. The TTP also proved to be a friend with benefits to the Pakistani generals for their domestic agenda. In the 2018 election, it coerced the secular nationalist Awami National Party out of the contest with suicide attacks on its leaders. Like the military's despot Zia-ul Haq in the 1970s, clearly the generals believed that doing away with parties striving for democratization and federal autonomy was more important than a terrorist threat. The Islamists were a logical ally in taking on the Democrats, even if there was a bill for their services. Yet, things haven't gone perfectly according to this general's battle plan. A much-hyped ceasefire with the TTP, respected mainly in the breach by the jihadis, collapsed in December. The Taliban, moreover, flatly refused to rein in the TTP. Negotiations between the government and Nur Wali Mahsood, announced soon after the fall of Kabul to the Taliban, have gone nowhere. Violence, as I said earlier, has inched upwards. The core answer to why the TTP has again turned on its ISI patrons and why the Taliban isn't willing to bail out the generals is embedded deep in history. From the 1820s, what is now called Khyber Pakhtunkhwa witnessed an extraordinary clerical revival, which led, among other things, to Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi's famous if failed war against the Sikh Empire. The work of the historian Sana Haroon teaches us. Sayyid Ahmad's last stand was at Balakot, an inspiration to the Jaish-e-Mohammed chief Masood Azhar Alvi and to many other South Asian jihadis. Expansion of clerical power back then, in the 19th century, was enabled by generous cash payouts from the regimes of Dost Muhammad Khan and Abdur Rahman Khan, the Afghan kings, as well as the British, all of whom competed to cajole compliance, purchase leverage, or split their enemies. In the absence of competitive politics, the clerics also emerged as the sole mode of opposition to the often tyrannical rule of the tribal maliks or chieftains. Imperial Britain was in a state of almost constant war with the border tribes as it sought to secure its northern flank against Russian expansion. Independent Pakistan inherited its desire to subject the Pashtuns to strong central authority. Indeed, at the mess of the Waziristan scouts in Wana, there's still a display of a portrait of Lieutenant Colonel R.H. Harman, who was killed by a Masood tribesman in 1905. The lesson for clerical networks in borderlands has been simple. War making is a good way of extracting concessions from both Kabul and Islamabad. The TTP and the Taliban have now shown they understand this dynamic well. The TTP is, moreover, driven not just by ideology, but by 3 generations of young people with little traditional tribal status, learning that you can get a lot further with a gun than from an education. For the generals, a moment of decision is fast approaching. Noorwali is seeking a Sharia-governed mini-state in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. That demand could be granted, but only at the risk of providing future terrorists safe havens. The Pakistan state is unlikely to collapse, but war could lie ahead. The other option is to crack down on the jihadists and open the way to democratic political forces. This, though, could lead to a sharp short-term escalation in violence. Either way, the decision will guide Pakistan's destiny. I'm Praveen Swami, and I'm National Security Editor at ThePrint.